Sutton's here now. We can go ahead and start. All right, first item on the agenda. Request for bill introductions. Are there any bill introductions? Mr. Barker, come on up.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Clay Barker, General Counsel for the Kansas Secretary of State. We'd like to introduce House Bill 26 RS 2785, which has to do with improvements to the regulation system, the ideas that were presented to the interim committee this summer.
All right, seeing no objection, we'll go ahead and make that request.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for coming. Are there any further bill introductions? This is just a reminder that Monday is the last day to request a bill in this room. You were all emailed Kansas Housing Investor Tax Credit Program document today. It's a statutory requirement that they report it every year. So that was in your email box today. We may review that at a later date, but it's there for you to review if you'd like to. Okay. I'm going to bring up for discussion HB 2464, and for a brief explanation of what the aviation tax credit bill is, and then what this bill does, is I'll call on Revisor Reimer.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. So as the committee heard yesterday, this bill extends the sunset for the aviation tax credit program. Currently, that program expires December 31st, 2026. So coming up here this December. In the bill before you would extend that sunset for 10 years to December 31, 2036. So a quick summary of the aviation tax credit. There are 3 credits. As you heard, the first one is for employers. It's a tuition reimbursement credit. If an employer reimburses tuition for an employee, pursuant to the provisions of the tax credit, the employer gets a tax credit. The second one is also for employers. It's a compensation credit. It's for compensation paid to employees based on the terms of the bill, of the credit, rather the statute. And finally, the third one is an employee income tax credit. So the first one, this you can find at KSA 7932-291. It allows specific employers, and those are employers that are in the aviation aerospace industry, and those are defined terms, means relating to vehicles or objects for the purpose of suborbital, orbital, or space flight, whether for private or public or civil or defense-related purposes. Aviation means relating to vehicles or objects except parachutes for the purpose of controlled flight through the air, regardless of how propelled or controlled, or whether manned or unmanned, whether for private or public or civil or defense-related purposes. So that's a pretty broad definition. It would include drones and airplanes and that kind of thing. And then there's also a definition for aviation sector, which you can find in the bill as well. So again, the first credit is for employers. It allows employers to take in credit for reimbursements they have made to their employees for tuition. If they've graduated from a professional graduate program or technical degree within a year either before being hired or a year after being hired. The credit is 50% of the tuition reimbursed. It can't exceed 50% of an average annual amount that's determined by the Secretary of Revenue. So there's a sort of a limit on that. And it's applied against the income tax liability of the employer after all other credits have been taken. So this is sort of the last credit that can be applied. It's not refundable. It cannot be carried forward. The compensation income tax credit, you'll see that at $79,32,292. Again, that's a credit for employers for compensation paid to qualified employees during their first through fifth consecutive years of employment. And that credit is an amount that's equal to 10% of the compensation paid. There's a limit of $15,000 per annually for each qualified employee. This credit is applied against the taxpayer's income tax liability after all other credits. It's not refundable and it cannot be carried forward. The final credit is the employee income tax credit, and that is for taxpayers who become qualified employees. It's a credit in the amount of $5,000. It can be claimed for each of up to 5 years. Now, this credit can be carried over for deduction from year to year, but only after the fourth taxable year succeeding the taxable year in which the credit was first allowed. The other thing about this program is that there's a reporting requirement. I just point that out. The secretaries annually submit a written report to the House Committee on Appropriations and the Senate Committee on Ways and Means concerning the program. And that, again, is the program in a summary fashion. Again, it's really aimed at the aerospace industry. Tuition paid for employees to facilitate education. Those employees, a credit for the employees themselves, and a credit for compensation for those employees.
Thanks, Charles. Are there any questions on the program? Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify, Charles, we're not changing the program. We're just moving the sunset date back. Is that correct?
That's correct, Representative. Yes, currently the program, just to be precise, no new credits could be earned or issued after December 31, 2026. So we're changing that date 10 years out to December 31, 2036.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I asked him to give a description of what the underlying bill does so that everybody kind of got a good idea what they're voting on. So, any further discussion or questions for Mr. Reimer? All right, seeing none. Okay, for discussion on the bill, does anyone have amendments to suggest? Okay, seeing none, I need a motion to pass favorably. HB 2464.
I move we pass HB 2464 favorably out for passage.
Seconded by Representative Laura Williams. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. All against say no. Motion passes. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move on to Commerce Conversations. And our first conferee was he went through kind of a presentation for some freshmen and a few senators that came into the Kansas City area at Margaritaville one day. And there was a lot of exciting things going on in the energy sector. And I asked him, Chuck, to come in here to discuss it with us today, because it's my belief that if Kansas can be a leader in power, that all of these other incentive programs aren't going to really matter going forward, because with what's going on in advanced manufacturing and data centers and where everything's being built, these companies are moving to states that can supply the power, and they don't really care about anything else. And so I asked him to kind of give us an update on kind of what we're doing and what we need to do and what we can do to help get ahead of that curve. So Chuck, thanks for coming in today, and I really appreciate it.
You betcha. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, Madam Ranking Member, and members of the committee. Happy to be here today. I'm also really happy that the chairman decided to wear shoes today, so I didn't have to stare at his feet throughout the presentation, which was not the case at Margaritaville. So anyway.
I actually forgot my shoes that day.
True story. It's really hard to, as a matter of fact, to concentrate on giving a presentation to 25, 30 people when you've got a wiggling big toe in front of your face. So anyway, hopefully I'll be a little more on task today, a little less distracted. Wanted to walk through really a couple things, give you a very brief overview as to where we are. I mean, when people want to talk about economic development and they want to talk about utilities, there's really two things that people talk about right now. One is rates. And what is this going to do to rates? So I want to address a little bit about where we are and how that's going in Kansas. Then I want to talk just a little bit about how economic development really does benefit and help to keep rates stable. And in the case of data centers, is really going to be a key tool in helping to push rates down over time, put downward pressure on rates. And then a little bit about what the KCC and us and some other stakeholders have done to kind of anticipate and work through this data center kind of, situation that we have where that's large manufacturing, advanced manufacturing like Panasonic and data centers really are starting to take over the market in terms of economic development. So that'd be the agenda today. For those of you on the utility committee, I apologize. Some of this will be a repeat for you, but there's only a few. So first of all, since we have not been in the Commerce Committee in just a little bit, just a recollection for those of you who don't know, Evergy was actually formed out of two utilities, which would have been Westar and KCP&L, and we became a utility in 2018. And so that's roughly what our service territory looks like. The green in Kansas is Evergy Kansas Central, and the blue area is Evergy Kansas Metro, which are two distinct service territories, but all under the Evergy umbrella. So Evergy Kansas Central has Topeka, it has Lawrence, Manhattan, Salina, Pittsburgh, it has Wichita, Hutch, whereas the blue part, which is Evergy Kansas Metro, is really more of Johnson County and a couple of collar counties around the Kansas City area. We're about 1.7 million customers. That's up from 1.6 million customers approximately when we put the company together in 2018. And that is indicative of something that's really good for the state and really good for energy prices generally, which is growth. The other thing I should just mention, I'm not going to do every single slide in here. I'll skip a couple of them, and if there's questions or things you want me to go back to, I'd be happy to. But in the effort of time, I'll try and be somewhat expeditious. The good news for Kansas is that over the last 8 years, from 2017 through the end of 2025, we have had some of the lowest rate increases in the entire United States. You can see sitting in the middle of the Midwest there in the bright green, 2.2%. This is actually Wells Fargo taking a look at the 5 years leading up to 2024. Was the average rate increase across the state of Kansas. That compares favorably to every single one of our neighbors, including Missouri, which we also serve. One of the primary reasons that we put together Evergy from Westar and KCP&L is it gave us the opportunity to drive about $350 million out of our operating costs. The significance of that is a couple of things. One, every dollar we take out of operating costs yields $7 that we can invest in maintaining the system without raising rates. So that $350 million meant we could invest more than $2 billion into the electrical grid without having a upward pressure on rates. That's a big part of why over the last year the last 8 years, we've been able to keep rates as stable as we have. The second thing about this, though, is the more competitive rates are, generally, the better we're going to do in economic development. And economic development is the second big tool that we have, or load growth, in keeping rates stable. And I'm actually going to go through a little bit of lawyer math here in a couple slides and show you just visually how that works. So just for reference sake, though, over the last 8 years, from 2017 to 2025, through October of 2025, Evergy Kansas Central, again, that's the area that serves all the way out to Wichita, their rates for residential customers went up 8.3%, and Evergy Kansas Metro actually had a decrease in rates over that time period. One of 3 jurisdictions in the United States that over that time period actually saw a decrease. That's while all the neighboring states had rates that went up around 23%, and the cost of inflation over that time period was right around 29%. If you look now, residential rates in Kansas are below the average in surrounding jurisdictions, and so are bills. If we had had this conversation 8 years ago, the green bars representing Evergy would have been towards the left-hand side of the screen. We would have had higher rates than a lot of our peer companies. That is not the case anymore. For residential rates, commercial rates, it's under the average of all those states, and we've seen very little price increase over the last 8 years. When you get to the all sector, meaning all of the rates combined, you can see that we are still right in the middle, which means this is a place that we want to get better. And when you look at industrial rates and you look at Evergy and Evergy Kansas, while we are now below the growth of what other jurisdictions have seen, we are still right at the average. The rack industrial rate, meaning what you pay as an industrial consumer, in Kansas is a little bit higher unless you have a special contract than neighboring states. However, it is not something that has proven detrimental to economic development. In fact, quite the opposite, because what customers want these days is access to power and reliability, and those are 2 things that we can give them in spades. One of the conversations that we have in the Capitol all the time is that rates get adjusted for 4 or 5 different major adjustments, from everything from taxes to fuel to transmission, outside of rate cases. So we'll have a rate case maybe every 2 or 3 years when we bring new assets that we've invested in and put on the grid. And there is a lot of conversation most years about, well, maybe that's the only time rates should be adjusted, after an 8 or 9 month rate case where you can consider everything. But the fact of the matter is, the riders that exist, and principally here, the 2 biggest ones are for fuel and they are for transmission investments. They go up and they go down outside of rate cases. And it's about 50-50 over the last 8 years. 50% of the time they went up, 50% of the time they went down. But if you take all of the riders that have adjustments outside of rate cases, what you'll see is a big part of keeping rates at and below surrounding states has been that the riders have acted by and large to return money to customers more quickly. The green line there is the sum total in each year of the upward movements and downward movements in those adjustments. The black line is $0. And you can see that through 2017, 18, 19, 20, and 21, those adjustments outside of rate cases were net adjustments down and actually returned money to customers more quickly. Now you see the spike there that happened in 2022. That is actually the response from Winter Storm Uri. Particularly in Evergy, Kansas Central, there was a significant amount of purchase power and fuel, particularly natural gas, that spiked during that 4-day period, and that caused the adjustments to net go up. But over the last 8 years, the sum of all of these things has been a net positive and a big part of keeping rates low and stable in Kansas. So now let's talk about economic development. I told you earlier that, we often hear this phrase, energy is a tax, a tax on business, and that tax on business is keeping Kansas from being competitive. And that's simply not the case. We are involved in almost every single major economic development opportunity that comes to the state of Kansas. In fact, we're usually one of the first entities that is called. And even when it's in a municipality or if it is in a cooperative area, many times we get called anyway because it's generation that they want to buy from us that helps feed their system and attract those customers. But what I want to point out is, over the last 7 years, this is 2019 through 2025, Kansas has been in one of the best economic development booms of its entire history. This is $9 billion of outside capital that was invested in Kansas over that time period, creating more than 16,000 jobs. And of the 109 projects that we worked on, major economic development projects in both Missouri and Kansas during that time period, more than 60% of them went to Kansas. So Kansas, contrary to what some folks say, is not having a difficult time growing or supporting business. In fact, it's just the opposite. Represented in this list is a group of companies that are household names that have made major investments in the area. I'm just going to name some of them.
I'm going to pause you just for a second. I had invited the energy chair to join us today as a guest, and just to keep you honest. So
That's good.
now
He
that
does
he's
a good
here.
job of that.
So, and if you have any questions, sir, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to call on you.
Mr. Chairman. So we were just talking about the economic development that's been going on in Kansas over the last 8 or 9 years. In that $9 billion are companies like Amazon putting up huge logistics in Kansas, Walmart as well, Hostess, Bartlett Grain, Deloitte, Schwann's, Hill's Pet Nutrition, FedEx, Coleman, Merck, Honeywell, and Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola put their most modern and their largest bottling plant anywhere west of the Mississippi in Kansas just a couple years ago. It was a $500 million investment. And believe me, the soda market is something where it is almost like a commodity, very price sensitive. If they didn't think they could compete on all fronts, including electricity in Kansas, they would not be here. Site Selection Magazine, probably nobody here has ever heard of that, but Site Selection Magazine is kind of the Bible for the big consulting firms that go out and they work to attract and place big capital investments for big companies. They said at the end of 2025 that Kansas has quietly built an economic development dynasty over the last several years. And literally in the last 5 years, they've given 12 of their top awards to Kansas as one of the per capita best states in the business to do economic development. So now let's talk about what is on everybody's mind, which is data centers. What does it mean, and what is Kansas doing to protect consumers and to make sure that rates don't go up? So the first thing is, if you know anything about data centers, you hear two major complaints, mostly coming out of the East. And that is, it's making rates skyrocket, and it is problematic for water. We're by no means a water expert, but we do deal now with multiple data centers, and I can tell you that the water situation is really something that's probably 2 or 3 years, 5 years old now. Almost every data center that is getting put up these days has what's called a closed water system, where they bring water in, they treat it, they use it, and they just keep recycling it through their facility. So it shouldn't be what we've seen in the past, which is water in, water used, water out that has to be treated. That's good news for the environment, and it's specifically good news for the western parts of Kansas, central and western parts of Kansas, where water is a really precious commodity and something we need to be really careful about. Now let's talk about electricity. It's absolutely true that if you go to places like South Carolina, if you go to places in PJM, which is the Northeast regional transmission area, you have seen rate increases of 10, 15, 20, 25% that mostly can be attributed to data centers coming in and using all of the existing generation capacity and passing those rates on to all customers kind of evenly. We saw that That is a real problem. And what you're going to see here in a minute is economic development works only so long as the amount of electricity these folks are consuming is more and has more benefit than the amount of investment they force you to make into the grid. If you're making more investment for not enough usage, that's going to drive prices up. Or if you're not charging enough for the investment they're causing, that's going to drive prices up. And so we wanted to be very proactive here in Kansas. And so almost a year ago, we filed what we called our large load power service tariff. It was just approved at the end of last year, I think October of 2025. And that large load power service tariff, or LLPS, is specifically targeted at data centers and large load customers. And it does some things that are very key to make sure the kinds of rate increases that have been seen on the eastern and southeastern areas of the country don't happen here. It's actually, it was passed by the commission. We had support from existing industrial customers. The Kansas regulatory staff were incredibly helpful in crafting this. And the truth is that it's one of the first tariffs or rate designs of its kind in the United States. And I think what you will see over the coming year, year and a half, is a lot of states copy Kansas. In fact, Missouri just did. Just 2 months after Kansas passed this, Missouri put up their hands and said, this is a good idea, we're going to do the same thing. So let me tell you just a little bit about it and how it works. The first thing is that data centers, without a doubt, will cause us to have to build more generation. So they need to pay for it. And within this rate, there's multiple parts of an industrial rate, but one of them is called a demand charge. And that demand charge has almost a 30% premium for data centers and large load customers, meaning we're charging them for that component of their rate almost 30% more. Over their whole rate, somewhere between 15 and 25% premium, depending on how much they use and how big they are. That is one of the first places in the United States that's ever happened. You want to come here, we're not going to give you a discount. We're not going to charge you what all of the existing industrial consumers pay. We want you to pay more because you are going to be causing us to invest more, and you ought to pay for that. The second big issue that these large facilities pose is the amount of capital investment is significant, and if we're going to do that, we don't want to make that investment and then have them leave the state. So the second thing that the large load power service tariff or rate does is it requires all of these customers to sign a 17-year contract. 17-year contract. To put that in perspective, these bills could be somewhere in the vicinity of $200 to $300 million a year, and they've got to sign up to pay that for 17 years. Not only do they have to do that, but it requires them to post collateral, some of the biggest collateral postings of any company in state history. So we're working on a couple of data center deals right now for Kansas and Missouri, and the collateral that I think they will post under this rate will be somewhere in the vicinity of $300 to $500 million for the privilege of doing business in the state. And then they have to post a parental guarantee that would cover past that. If they break the deal, they're responsible for the rest of the 17 years of the contract. Again, to put that in perspective, we have multiple very large customers that are refineries, they manufacture things. None of them to locate in the state today have had to post collateral. None of them had to sign contracts. But if a data center is going to come here and is going to cause us to make this investment, then we are going to protect Kansas customers by making sure that they sign long contracts and post collateral. They're also going to pay more. So, why do we care about this so much? Great, you're mitigating the risk, but what's in it for Kansas customers? Why should we care? Now, this is what I said was the lawyer math, and I apologize. It means it's very high level, it's demonstrative, and I'm sorry to take you through math, but to understand this visually, you got to take a look at this. Plus, I think this is maybe the slide that Chairman Tarwater wanted me to send, because this is what got a lot of conversation going with the freshmen when we talked to them. So let's just say, so first of all, your rates at a very high level are really simple. It's the cost to operate the grid right, divided by how many units of electricity or kilowatt hours are consumed every year. Now, in this illustrative example here, in the first set of blue bars, you see that the cost is $10,000. And we have 10,000 kilowatt hours is what, this particular fictional system consumes. Well, that means your rate is $1 a kilowatt hour. Now, moving on to the second set of boxes, what happens every year? Well, we have inflation. Salaries go up. Healthcare costs go up. The price of steel goes up. Everything we do goes up, which means that's going to put upward pressure on rates, and we have to continue to invest to maintain the system. So costs are going to go up. Regardless what we do, costs will go up. And so you can see we put $250 worth of cost in this, in the cost bucket. But what happens for the last 5 or 6, probably from, I would say, 2005 through about 2018-19 is we had very, very low growth, meaning residential customers weren't using more, actually they were using less. And there was a huge effort by commercial and industrial consumers to reduce how much electricity they were using. So you don't have a growth in kilowatt hours very much. Well, you can see what happens with just a little bit of cost increase and not very much growth. Your rate moves from $1 to the dollar, $1.50 there. So then you get normal economic development. That's what's happening over the last, say, 6-7 years, where we're seeing really strong, really good economic development in Kansas. That's our third set of examples. You still have growth in costs, but now the number of users and how much they're using keeps pace with it, and so all else being equal, rates stay solid. Final set of examples here, though, is what happens with data centers. Well, you still have your normal cost increases, you still have your normal growth, so that kind of nets out. But now you have these really big users that are going to cost a lot of money to bring on. And so that's represented by adding $1,200 in the cost category in the numerator here, because we're going to invest to bring these folks in. But what you can see underneath it is we're going to add about 1,800 kilowatts. So more growth, more usage than cost to bring them on. And look what happens to the rate. The rate goes down. So the rate will either go down over time with these customers, or what it will allow us to do is to continue to invest in the system and still keep rates stable and keep rates well within what we would say is the cost of inflation. We've beaten inflation the last 8 years. The goal would be to continue to be able to do that. One other slide, and this is something the chairman hasn't seen, but this is just a graphic representation of how the large load power service tariff actually works. That premium that we talked about, we don't keep that. Our shareholders don't keep that. When we come in for a rate case, we take that premium and we take all the load growth that's associated with a data center or a large load manufacturer, and we reduce the rate impact to all other customers that are existing. So in this particular case, you have a $100 million rate case, but you have about $40 million of load growth and premium, and we take all of that and we divide it up and we give it to existing residential customers, existing commercial customers, and existing industrial customers to lessen significantly the impact of the rate case. We are going to file a rate case in Missouri this year. We have a data center that we're going to announce at the exact same time. Somewhere in the vicinity of 30 to 50% reduction in what that rate case will be is what that data center is going to contribute to the rate case in Missouri. So we are expecting it to be anywhere from 30% to 50% less than it would have been because of this new customer. So to give you an idea of what's out there and what the magnitude of the opportunity is, we took this straight from our investor relations presentation that we did in the third quarter of last year. To give you an idea how big we are, we peak on a hot August day around 4 o'clock, with electrical usage that's about 10,000 megawatts or 10 gigawatts. That's all people, all businesses using as much electricity at one time as they're likely to use. We're about 10 gigawatts, and it's taken us 135 years to build to that point. Right now in our queue, we have more than 15 gigawatts of large load and data centers interested in coming to Kansas and Missouri, with about 60 to 65% of it probably looking at Kansas. That means if we took all of it, if we could serve every last bit of it, it would be more than 1.5 times an addition to the size that we are today. Now, we can't possibly address all of that. We can't possibly serve all of that. And some of it's double counted from projects potentially in other states. And some of it is stuff that probably you wouldn't want us getting into because it would be riskier or not really good credit quality companies. But that gives you an idea of how big this opportunity is. This opportunity for states like Kansas and Missouri is every bit as big as the interstate highway system, is every bit as big as building railroads or telegraphs across the United States. Commerce is going to follow this opportunity, and bringing these in with the right price and the right conditions is going to help make Kansas, and for us, Missouri, more competitive all across the board. So I mentioned earlier it is about price and getting the right price, and it's about economic development, and it's also about reducing your operating costs as much as you can. But people, when they're locating their business, want something that's even more important to them, which is reliability. And I'm happy to report that the best year we've had for reliability in our company's history just ended. 2025, we had fewer outages, and the outages that we did have were of shorter duration, which means that while we're keeping rates steady, and it's only gone up well underneath inflation over the last 8 years, you're still getting Tier 1 reliability, which is also very important in attracting customers. That's just a visual representation of what it's looked like over the years for Tier 1 reliability. And the only other thing I would say, and what I want to kind of end with, is two things. I want to talk about the fact that we need to continue to invest. Every year, we invest billions of dollars into the system, whether it is for generation, which is critically important to getting these data centers here. It's also critically important to start to transition our fleet. If I polled this committee, the views on whether coal is good or bad would probably be pretty interesting to hear. But the fact of the matter is, whether you love coal or hate coal, our coal plants are on an average about 45 years old. That's like owning a car with 100,000 miles. At some point, the transmission is going to drop out. At some point, it's not going to make sense to keep repairing the car, and you want to get a new car. So we're investing in new natural gas generation, two of which large plants are going up in the Wichita area, one up by Hutch and one southwest of Wichita. We're also investing considerably in transmission and the electrical grid. This is just one view of the age of our system, but this looks at wooden poles in Kansas Central, which is, again, the bigger part of our Kansas service territory. Better than 50% are over 50 years old, which means we've got to continually invest in the system to make sure that it remains reliable. And the only other thing I wanted to talk about just real quick is some of you probably heard about our partnership with Kansas and our partnership with TerraPower. It's a three-way partnership, and it's really to kind of get Kansas first in line for whenever nuclear power becomes competitive from a cost perspective. We are one of 30 utilities out of about 150 nationwide that own and operate a nuclear power plant. It's one of the most valuable assets that we own. It's 40 years old now, and hopefully it will be running for another 40 years. But the fact of the matter is, as we start to look into the future, somewhere in the 7 to 10 year time frame, we are very hopeful that small modular nuclear reactors become part of the mix. Why aren't we building them today? That is the very first question that we get. Well, none of the small modular nuclear reactors right now, none of that technology has been authorized or licensed, approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Committee and probably won't be for the next year to 2 years. And there's no actual small modular nuclear reactors on a commercial basis operating in the United States right now. But the bigger reason is because for the same amount of power, it's going to cost somewhere between 4 times to 10 times as much as a combined cycle natural gas plant. So if we spend $1 billion to get you 500 megawatts worth of electricity from natural gas today, to try and replicate that with a nuclear plant right now would be somewhere between $5 billion and $10 billion. And to try and put another Wolf Creek out there, which is our 1,200 megawatt nuclear facility that we have today, that would be somewhere between $15 and $30 billion, which would be at about 100% rate increase for all of your constituents, and nobody wants that. So we want to be first in line. We want to make sure that this energy is available for Kansans in the near future. But we don't want to go out and we don't want to spend money now on nuclear energy that is more expensive and hasn't been licensed, and we don't know enough about it yet. But we want to be first in the queue. So that's really what I had to say today. And if there's any questions, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take them.
I know your time is short. Committee, are there any questions for Mr. Casely? Representative Christy Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. I'm glad that you would still want to be in the queue for nuclear, because I think there is a huge opportunity there. I do want to ask you a question, just really one question about your handout on pages, I think it's the pages 3. It's your map and page 6 and page 8. So page 6 and page 8, you share about the rates, but I'm curious about the effective rate increases or the total bill impact compared to other states. So if we look at all the charges, whether it's, I don't know, transmission, you mentioned that, transmission delivery charges, or any other types of charges that we all end up paying, how do all of those costs compare if we look at the cumulative impact with our other states, both residential and commercial? And is there a way for you to provide us something that looks exactly like page 6 and 8 with those cumulative costs, rather than just the rate? Because the rate is just a portion of the overall cost, and I'm just curious how we compare.
Right, absolutely. So that's a great question. And one of the conversations we get quite a bit, which is percentage increase, great. Glad we're not growing anywhere near as fast as other folks, but what does the pure rate or the bill look like? I think we do have the rate in here for residential customers. So this is the rate, and that's all in. That's with everything. That's not base rates. That is the cumulative effect of all charges, base rates, everything. So that's the effective rate that you would pay. And then I don't remember if we have the bills. Yes, we have an average residential monthly bill. And as you can see, Evergy Kansas Metro is a little bit higher than Evergy Kansas Central, but both are below the regional average. Now, for industrial consumers and for commercial, they vary so much in size, it's not easy to compare. You can get a comparable average for residential customers, but we can look by class within industrial. Happy to talk about those. I can also tell you that there are 5 customers in our system in Evergy, Kansas service territory. They're all actually in Central. They're not in Metro, but they're all in Central. And those 5 customers, which I would describe as highly, they're very low margin businesses and highly affected by commodities, not just electricity, but multiples. They have what's called special contracts, which means they have discounts relative to their, what would be the rack industrial rate. And the entire purpose for that is to be able to go in front of the Kansas Corporation Commission and say, listen, in order to be competitive relative to Colorado or relative to Oklahoma, we need a lower rate here. And 5 customers, several refineries, Boeing, formerly Spirit, has one of those. And all totaled, those 5 customers have around a $65 to $66 million discount to what their bill would have been based purely on making them as competitive as possible with neighboring states.
Okay, that's super helpful. So actually then on page 8, the actual effective rate increase for Kansas was 8.7 compared to all the peers that you listed for any subcharge or additional charge, all of it.
Residential customers, yes.
That's great. We're moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Representative Watzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Being from one of the places that doesn't have a lot of water, I'm not one of your customers, but I would like to know, and I don't know if you have this information, what's the initial amount of water a data center needs? How long can they recycle that water, and how much is lost while they're recycling? Because we know that there has to be some loss in the middle of it.
There is water loss. Unfortunately, I am not an expert on that, so I probably can't answer you that. I know that in 2 of the data centers that we're working with right now, on an annual basis, they're looking at something that's upwards of a 90% efficiency, meaning that once they get their system, built, it's 90% of the water stays intact. These are closed loop systems, so there's not a lot of evaporation or things like that, and there's not a lot of heat dissipation either as a result. But how much they use, what they use on startup, it's so dependent on the size, and it's also dependent on what they do with it. A lot of these entities now will mix it with something similar to glycol, in order for it to retain its cooling properties a little longer. And there may be some other reasons that they do it. So I'm not an expert. I would be happy, though. There's a data center coalition that can probably get you that information. I'd be happy to help connect you with those folks, because it is a real issue to be aware of.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Mr. Chair. One additional. With the glycol, how long does it, when you're finished with, it's a closed system, but at some point in time, I'm thinking you're going to have to replace the closed system, which goes back to how much water is used anyway. But how well can you clean that water in order for it to go back into Kansas water systems?
Another great point. Again, I'm not familiar with all of what they do. I do know that the 2 major projects we're working on in Kansas, they are working with the local municipality and are providing a way to get it back to at least gray water state, or better than the plants that they have for processing right now. In fact, we were talking with one of them the other day that was talking about 50% of the community's water came from processed water and 50% came from, it was new source water. And that they were looking to add to that total reclaimed water amount under the same standards that they use today with the data center that they're looking at. This is not something I am very familiar with the details on. I could go a lot deeper on the electrical side, but know that it's an issue, which is why I always bring it up.
Okay, I'd love to see some of that.
Yeah,
Appreciate
absolutely.
It. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, so we're up against the time. You said you had to leave.
I'll stay as long as there's questions. I'll
Okay,
just be a little
so
late.
Representative Wilcott and then Bohai.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I had 2, but if I can only do one, I'll just do the one. On page 8, that effective rate, it looks like all of our direct neighbors are below us. So Iowa, Missouri, Oklahoma, Arkansas, South Dakota, Nebraska doesn't report. And you'd reported earlier that all of our polls 50% of our polls are kind of at that end of life. So we're going to have some continual investment of that distribution. What's driving what is everybody else doing real close to us that's keeping their rates down? Is it power generation costs?
So it's actually just the opposite. So if you look at Oklahoma, for example, their rates have gone up 22.9% in the last 8 years, whereas ours are up 8.3%.
I'm sorry, page 9.
Oh, page 9.
The actual rate itself, not the change.
Gotcha. Well, there's a variety of different things. So for example, Oklahoma for years and years has been on they're almost exclusively natural gas. They also make a lot of natural gas there, store a lot of natural gas there. So their commodity costs for natural gas, their transportation costs for natural gas is simply a lot less than neighboring states. And that has been part of their secret. It's been part of Texas's secret over the last, I would say, decade to decade and a half. You can see that Texas has now gone considerably up. We're in a constrained supply environment, and so the law of supply and demand is now operating viciously in Texas. They've had some of the biggest rate increases over the last 8 years because prices are going through the roof because supply is low and demand is very high. Oklahoma was at the very bottom of that chart 8 years ago. They had the lowest rates in the region. They are, I would say, if things continue as they are, they will probably cross over in most sectors within the next 2 or 3 years so that our rates will actually be lower than Oklahoma's. If you look at the average bill that a residential customer has, everybody likes to talk about rates, but it's also lifestyle and how much energy you use in the year. And if you look at the actual average bills, we're doing better than Oklahoma and considerably better than Oklahoma. While their rates are lower, the average residential consumer in Oklahoma pays just under $140 a month for their electric bill, whereas Wichitans would be in the 125 area, 123, 125, and Kansas Cityans on the Kansas side would be in the 130 area.
Representative Baha'i.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So good to see you again this week.
To see you.
And I would be remiss if I did not say once again, thank you for helping a small business in the KC metro area get reconnected after there was an outage. It meant a lot to them. My question is, when you were giving us this slide 18 on how the LLPs help lower rate case impacts, my question is, how did you structure it so that the premium was coming back to those 3 buckets? Is that in a statute or was that in the rate case?
No, so that it wasn't, it's actually, it's a tariff, which is kind of the Kansas Corporation Commission equivalent of a statute. It's a formal adopted rate that you vote on. And so the process, briefly, is that we propose a rate structure, and then anybody who wants to can come and argue whether it's fair, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it needs to do something else. What we did not want to do is special contracts for these customers because special contracts aren't particularly transparent, and depending on who you are, you think your ox is getting gored by somebody else. The other thing we wanted to make sure we did was to make sure that these entities, when they came to the state, paid more than our existing customers for the investment that they were causing. And so, we put together something, and we actually worked with Consumer Council, we worked with the Industrial Coalition, who was incredibly helpful throughout the process. There's a data center coalition that actually weighed in on this as well, and we worked with Kansas staff, who I would say had some of the best input that we got. And they're the folks who are going to sit there and say, look, we're going to stress test this and make sure this is actually going to do what folks say it's going to do, that will actually compensate for the investment being made. And what ended up happening was a settled rate that provided these terms. It was substantially similar to what we filed, but there was a lot of negotiation over how much collateral would have to be signed, what kind of guarantees would have to be given, what would the term of the contract be, and then obviously when it comes to charging a premium, that was a big part of the conversation.
So I too was kind of interested in your large load program, and that 17-year contract, is that variable or is that set? And what happens if your costs increase?
That's set, and costs, so that's one of the beauties of this large load power service tariff or rate, is that 17 years is what it is. You get up to 5 years to build your load, but you've got to tell us from the very beginning of when you come here how much you expect to use at your facility, and then you've got 5 years to reach it. And then once you get to that 5 years, then it is an incremental 12-year term that you have to commit to running. And the reason for that really is that's right around 1/3 to 40% of the life of generation. If we're going to build a gas plant and it's going to be used considerably to serve you, well, you shouldn't be able to skip out of town, 5 years in and say, oops, we made a mistake, and just leave Kansans holding the bag. So that was, the period was to say we would get enough revenue and enough collateral and enough parental guarantee through those mechanisms that they would substantially pay for the asset before they could ever leave.
All right, well, thanks. And you probably got to go, and we have a couple other people to talk here. Chairman Delberding, did you have anything to add before Chuck leaves?
Yeah, if I could. I had a couple, but I realize you're short on time, so I don't want to tie it up too much. Quite a simple question here, and I don't know if you touched on TDCs before I got here. TDC, transmission delivery charges. That's an element that gets on our bill each month for fees. If that went away, what's that do to the electric rates?
Well, ultimately, it would make electric rates more expensive, and it'd make it more expensive for two reasons. One, we would probably almost instantaneously get a credit downgrade for Moody's and S&P, and I can explain why here in a second. And then the other thing is we would come in probably almost every year for a rate case, and there's rate case expense with that, but then there's also, so between those two things, making the cost of capital go up and coming in every single year for a rate case, that is what that would cause. As a little bit of background for this committee, the transmission delivery charge is one of those charges that goes up and down outside of a rate case. I think, and I wrote this down for your committee, Mr. Chairman, but I believe that over the last 8 years, it has gone up, the transmission delivery charge has gone up a total of 9 times, and it's been down 6 times. And so, so it's not just up, as some folks like to say. And the other thing is, Kansas is about 90 million square miles to serve, whereas Missouri is in the vicinity of 15 million square miles to serve. The fact of the matter is, to get transmission to the population centers in Kansas, we have about 2.5 times the amount of transmission wires and systems in Kansas as we do in Missouri. And if you took out Evergy, Kansas Metro, the bulk of that is in Evergy, Kansas Central. And so it just takes a lot more money and a lot more effort to maintain a system that has 5,200 miles of transmission on it.
Is it okay to continue, or I don't want to?
Yeah, one more, and then we've
more.
got the Patrick Vogelsberg here to talk about the gas that supplies the power plants.
Okay. I'm going to jump down. This is kind of off the wall here. Wolf Creek to Blackberry.
Yes.
Everybody keeps hitting us up. You're stealing all the electrons out of Wolf Creek Nuclear Power Plant to send it to Missouri. What really went down on that project? And how does that affect Kansas?
One, I guess we should just be really clear that 50% of that power plant was paid for and built by Missourians. So since its inception 40 years ago, it's been taking 50% of its electricity almost and sending it to Missouri because they paid for it. And the fact of the matter is that the 2 natural gas plants that we're building right around Wichita right now, at least 50% of one of them is being paid for by Missouri customers, and ultimately they'll have the benefit of that electricity. Why should you like that? Because all the tax base, all the jobs, all the benefits of having those facilities, that all goes to Kansas, but Missouri's paying for some of it. In the case of the Wolf Creek to Blackberry line, all that was a third line coming out of the nuclear reactor, and it was really for 2 things. One, wind in southwest Kansas was causing congestion on the system, which wouldn't allow us to get all of the electricity every day out of that facility, which is something you really want. And the other is just a third line, so if anything happened to one of the 2 that was serving it in a natural disaster, say a tornado, which we have a few of in Kansas, the integrity of the nuclear system would be protected.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks for coming in today.
Hey, Mr. Chairman,
we're gonna move on.
appreciate it.
Good luck. All right, Patrick, sorry that took so long. He's kind of long-winded.
No worries at all, Mr. Chairman, and I'm happy to cut out a few of my slides. But first off, I'm Patrick Volksberg with Kansas Gas Service. And at the outset, Mr. Chairman, I did want to thank you for providing this opportunity. Your comments at the very beginning are right out of my mouth, is that when it comes to economic development, energy is foundational, and it shouldn't be taken for granted. It is literally the first question that we get now from developers. It's not how much workforce do you have, it is how much energy do you have, how quickly can you get it to us, and if you can get it, how much capacity can we expand, and on what time frame. And so, you know, to give you an example of this, you know, if there's a $100 million project, whether it's one $100 million project or $100 million projects, if there's $1 million that needs to be expended to extend the energy infrastructure out to that either one project or multiple projects, if that $1 million isn't timely invested, it doesn't matter where the other 99 isn't coming. And for those big projects that we're looking at, a lot of times they're going to go to another state. And I'm directly familiar with some of those conversations that happen in our smaller communities. That just may be that they're constrained now. And we have a lot of those communities throughout the state that need to have, you know, there may be adding, you know, a handful of jobs. It's not the big project that we all like, that's, you know, 1,500 employees. But you take 5 employees here, 10 employees there, spread it out across all of our cities. It's extremely important. So thank you for that. And then the other thing, just by being here today, we're on the 3rd floor, right? And you guys talk about economic development here in this committee, and there's a lot of discussions on the 2nd floor and 1st floor around economic development, the administration, the governor's office, and lieutenant governor. But, and Chairman Delperdang is here. I really want to underscore that a significant portion of economic development happens up on the 5th floor in the Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee and the Senate Utilities Committee, because our company is 100% rate regulated by the Kansas Corporation Commission. So the terms and conditions of our service and what we charge our customers, that affects the timeliness of our investments. And those decisions are being made in those committees and through the Kansas Corporation Commission. So I'll get off my soapbox and into the presentation. So, all right, so this is a little bit about our company. So Kansas Gas Service, we're a division of One Gas, and we're 100% regulated across our 3 states. We also have Oklahoma Natural Gas and Texas Gas Service, 2.3 million customers, over 44,000 miles of pipeline. We're one of the largest publicly traded natural gas distribution companies in the nation. Here in Kansas, we're the largest natural gas utility. We have 651,000 customers, over 360 communities, and significant economic impact. I'll be a little bit timely here. One thing I wanted you to know, this map's very, very small. You can go to the KCC website, but we have certificated areas. Kansas Gas Service, we're in that light green, kind of come from southwest Kansas up through central and northeast. That's where our 360 communities are. But there's the other utilities, Black Hills Energy, Atmos Energy, Midwest Energy is that blue area out in the northwest area of the state. And then in between, there's small municipal gas utilities. So if you ever have a question about who your gas provider is, a lot of times it's not relevant, and that's a good thing. But I can tell you during Winter Storm Uri, it was extremely relevant where your constituents were getting their gas. Wellhead, the burner tip, little 101 here. We're a little bit different from the electric side. So our sources of gas, like I say, this isn't to scale, but our sources of gas, that first receipt point there, that's where we take custody of the gas, and that may be to a city gate or town border station. But it also may be into one of our transmission pipelines that runs across the state. But the sources are where gas is produced, right? Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, we source a lot of gas out of the Rockies as well. So, and that is a strategic advantage that Kansas has. that particularly in a storm like we just had here over the weekend, a lot of gas flows coming up from the south, and the south is being hit strongly, but we're also able to pull gas in from the Rockies, and that diversification of supply not only helps from a reliability standpoint, but it also helps from a pricing standpoint. I want to just hit this real quickly. There are a lot of benefits to natural gas and the continued access to it. But in order for those benefits to be realized, we must work together on energy policy. And energy policy, for the most part, it's fairly simple, it's fairly straightforward, right? It's physics and economics. And whenever we move outside of physics and economics and get into the political reasons, there is a way that it always reverts back to just physics and economics. But we have to work together on that. And in any one of these rooms, there's a lot of different voices that speak to energy issues, but there's a few of us that actually have a responsibility, a legal obligation to serve and make sure that for Mr. Casely's company, an electron gets moved from one point to another point, a molecule gets moved to one point to another point. And that's what our company's obligations are. But I would also include the members of the legislature, right? You're part of that and making sure you also have that obligation. So we work together on each one of these elements. With safety, I think of Kansas Underground Utility Damage Prevention Act, all right? That's Call Before You Dig, 811 in statute. The Move Over legislation for our utility workers. Reliability and safety, Gas System Reliability Policy Act, something that's been in place for over 20 years in the state that allows for us to make timely investments in our system that results in us having a 99.9% reliability rate for our natural gas service. Affordability, this is the affordability of the commodity itself, all right? That needs to be recognized, and a lot of that goes to our producers out there that keep finding those supply basins. But also, we work together to make sure that natural gas continues to be available to your constituents through the Energy Choice Act in 2021, where some regions of the country were looking to eliminate energy choice options. Kansas went a different route and was one of the leading states to first bring energy choice legislation. On the sustainability side of it, I do want to recognize that the most efficient use of a molecule of natural gas is its direct use, directly to the home, directly to the business. I'm going to go ahead, for the sake of time, move on off of that. This is just a snapshot of just total natural gas customers in the U.S. and Kansas. This isn't just KGS customers. It's all Kansas customers utilizing natural gas. In here, I just want to point out, there's 892,000 gas customers in the state. And really what I want you to take a look at, and this is a little bit to Mr. Casely's point around when you look at cost of service and then spreading those costs across a unit of energy. We're spreading those costs across MCF, 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas. Average residential customer in Kansas uses 73 MCF a year, all right? The average commercial customer uses 456 MCF a year. You get into an industrial, the average is 18,000, all right? Some of the customers that we have coming and talking to us are using what an industrial user will use in a year in 1 month or even 1 day. Significant amount of natural gas. And that is gonna really help overall spread those costs across, for all of our customers, to spread them across more MCF being utilized. So, but these are our customer counts, right? There's a lot of people behind the meter, and that's what we like to focus on. I know what's behind my gas meter at my house, and it's the most important people in my life. And I know what's behind the meter at a lot of businesses. It's the Kansas economy. This just gives you a snapshot of how natural gas is being utilized in the United States and Kansas. Follow that blue line on the right side. You see the wintertime peak, right? We maybe just hit the wintertime peak in Kansas this last weekend. We delivered a lot of natural gas to keep homes and businesses warm and the economy going. And then when that blue line drops off, those are the shoulder months. All right, that's a time period where maybe we're injecting natural gas into storage, and that's another great asset that the state has. Other usage, you'll see the industrial usage stays up, higher, consistent throughout the entire year. On the left-hand side, the one thing I'd point out on that is just the yellow line. That's the amount of natural gas that's going into power generation. And as you all know, Kansas Evergy is going to be building 2 new natural gas plants where there's going to be more natural gas going into electric generation, power generation in Kansas. And you're starting to see that a little bit bear out on the right-hand side yellow line. We're going to start seeing more natural gas going into power generation. All right, this is demand. Now, this is national data here. This is from the AGA. The natural gas system delivers 3.3 times more energy during the coldest day of the year than the electric system does on the hottest day of the year. It is an awesome amount of energy, huge amount of energy. And that's our responsibility. If you could imagine the load growth that the electric side is seeing, if we weren't doing our job, it would just be exacerbated. And so I think, again, when we get into the cold weather, it's critical that we continue to provide that service. We're very proud to do it, but it is very critical to keep homes and businesses going. And just a side note, the American Gas Association, this year, our CEO, Sid McAnally, is the chair of the American Gas Association. Not only is he a leader, great leader for our company, but recognized by his peers as being a leader in the industry with the other 200-some natural gas local distribution companies. Affordable energy, I will hit on this real quick. I'll leave this to you. In Kansas, natural gas has a 3.2 time advantage to electricity. So part of having affordable energy in the state is making sure that our infrastructure continues to be available to our customers. And I'm just going to speed up here real quick. This shows an advantage. Our service territories for one gas are also over top of some of the largest natural gas supply basins in the country. And if you look to the left, this is the developed pipeline infrastructure. Infrastructure is, and I think that this is a reason why a lot of companies, a lot of economic development is looking to Kansas in this region, because the energy is here, it's beneath our feet. And even if it's down in Oklahoma or Texas or in the Rockies, we can get it here via existing pipeline. That doesn't mean that new pipeline capacity doesn't need to come on, and new storage opportunities need to be explored also in the state. All right, opportunities. I mean, you heard Mr. Casely say it. There is significant economic development on the horizon for the state, and we want to be able to capture as much of that as possible. And so, again, going back to the affordability of natural gas, extend this energy option out to communities and businesses is extremely important. We work with Department of Commerce, we work with local economic development folks, mayors, developers, builders, and extending it out. There's advanced manufacturing opportunities, and there's growing opportunities in power generation. We serve power generation now. We serve utility power generation ourselves. And so just a reminder that the energy system is integrated, and we have a responsibility at the same level that the electrics need to be making investments, we need to be making investments as well. There are challenges. The upfront cost to extend infrastructure is certainly there, especially in rural areas. There are capacity constraints. And I hit on this briefly, but we are 100% rate regulated. So there is this thing called regulatory lag, and that is the time period between when we make an investment and then when we recover those investments in base rates. And that's something that reducing regulatory lag is going to be a key part of whether or not we can capture some of those opportunities. So, and then lastly, I'll leave this off, but building code adoption. Building codes is something that we follow very, very closely. And across the country, but also in our state, to make sure that there aren't any building code provisions that would start taking away the energy choice that our businesses and homeowners have. I did leave you with this. House Bill 2435 is legislation that Kansas Gas Service is pursuing this year. It's in Mr. Chairman's committee. We had a hearing on it last week, and we are having conversations with other interested stakeholders. We had a meeting just earlier today, and I'd be happy to tell Mr. Chairman the results of that. But this is something that hopefully comes across your desk on the House floor at some point. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to speed you up there.
No worries.
And I have nothing but faith in our chair of energy over there to make sure that that bill is right for Kansas and that it gets out of committee and moves on. I'm not going to allow questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to follow up with anyone offline.
We may have you back because I have a lot of questions, or I'll ask you them offline. But we got to get to the next presenter in committee. I know that we have until 3 o'clock, but if I would ask you if he goes a little bit over, it's very interesting stuff. And he came in yesterday from Emporia State University, and we had to move to today. And so I'm grateful that he came back again, and Mark Toomey is going to introduce him.
Thank you, Chairman Tarwater and members of the Commerce, Labor, and Economic Development Committee. I am Mark Toomey with Kansas Realtors. I'll first point out that that is a name change. We are no longer the Kansas Association of Realtors. We are simply Kansas Realtors. And Kansas Realtors are involved in residential, agriculture, and commercial real estate and have advocated on behalf of the state's property owners for more than 100 years. And in fact, we were created to lobby the legislature to strengthen real estate transaction laws in an effort to combat fraud perpetrated by unscrupulous brokers. So consumer protection and protecting private property rights is really at the heart of what we do. I also want to point out that becoming a realtor is a voluntary decision, and a realtor means that you're a member of the national, state, or local association of realtors. It also means you've agreed to follow a code of ethics that requires realtors to uphold high ethical standards beyond mere legal requirements. It also means that as a realtor, they hold a real estate license with the state of Kansas and often with many other states. And while all realtors have a license, not all real estate licensees are realtors. At the end of 2025, Kansas had 10,221 realtors, and there were 18,501 licensees. Licenses come from the Real Estate Commission, the state agency responsible for regulating and enforcing brokers and salespersons in Kansas. So now, for the real reason, we're here to have this conversation about economic conditions impacting our current housing market, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Stanley Longhofer. He is a consulting economist with Kansas Realtors. He will provide an overview of the current economic conditions impacting the housing across the state. Dr. Longhofer is a nationally recognized housing economist and professor at Wichita State University with more than 2 decades of experience analyzing housing and mortgage markets. So I'll turn things over to Dr. Longhofer for the remainder of the conversation, and we'll be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. Mr. Chairman, if I start to go long, just send me signals. I'll try and follow that to make sure that we move forward. What I wanted to do is to talk about affordability issues and what are some of the things that are impacting Kansas housing markets. I think I hit the advance button. There we go. The National Association of Realtors has a housing affordability index that some of you may have seen. It essentially asks the question of what percentage of income does the typical family have? How does that compare to what it would cost them to own the typical home in the United States? And the way you think about this index is 100 would mean that a family with median family income had exactly as much money as would be necessary to afford the mortgage payment, escrow, and so forth on the median priced home. 125 then would mean, oh, it's more affordable. I have 25% more income than I would need for that. And I always think that it's helpful when looking at these numbers to really have a long-term perspective. And so in this slide that I have here, I show you the Housing Affordability Index dating all the way back to the early 1980s. And there are a few things that I want you to note here with this. First of all, note that back in the early 1980s, when we were suffering really high inflation rates, housing affordability was at the lowest that we'd ever been. Essentially, high inflation rates mean that mortgage rates have to be very high, which means even if the housing itself is not very expensive, your payments that you're making on it are very expensive, making it more difficult for the typical family to afford that home. You will notice over the course of the 1980s and early 1990s, housing became more affordable over time, up to where we were in this range of about 130, 140, and we were there for a long period through the 1990s and early 2000s, which basically again meant that the typical American household had 30% more income than would be required in order to purchase the median priced home in the United States. We then began to see a real change in the wake of the financial crisis. By the way, those shaded regions on any of my charts, those are official recession dates. And so there in 2008 and 2009, you see the Great Recession in the wake of the financial crisis. And following that, housing affordability actually went way, way up. And that was because of the dramatic drop in mortgage rates that was engineered by the Federal Reserve through direct interventions in the mortgage market. And the thing that I really want to highlight about that period of time is that that period of time was abnormal and not something that we should have. I think we've adapted now to this thing where that's the way affordability ought to be, but that was extraordinarily unusual, and the mortgage rates that we had then were not sustainable and not something that we should expect going forward. In the wake of COVID, we saw some bouncing around, and then we saw a sharp decline in affordability across the United States. But where we are right now is actually right around that midpoint where we would say the typical American household has right about enough income to afford the median priced home. And in fact, this has actually improved since the last time I came to speak to, I think it was a joint committee that I spoke with. Back then, we were at about a 98% housing affordability index, and the most recent figures from last year is 108. So not nearly where we were, say, in the, what I consider the ideal world of the 1990s and early 2000s, but not nearly as severe as it may feel given the extreme unusual nature of what we had through the late teens and early 2000s, late teens and early 2020s. I'm going to skip over the National Association of Home Builders Housing Opportunity Index. It's a similar measure. Now, here's where I think it's really important to understand one of the driving factors behind this affordability measure is what's happened with 30-year fixed mortgage rates, and in particular, what we ought to expect going forward. Again, I mentioned that period of time where housing became very unaffordable. That was in the early 1980s when mortgage rates were extraordinarily high because of the high inflation rates that we were dealing with back then. The Fed spent about 25 years working slowly but steadily to bring inflation down to its target 2% inflation rate. And that's where we ended up with mortgage rates in the early 2000s that were actually very comparable to where we have them now. The extraordinarily the sub 5% and even down below 3% mortgage rates that we saw in the wake of the financial crisis and in the wake of COVID, those were unusual times. And I would argue with you that where we are today with mortgage rates that are in the low sixes are what we ought to expect to see going forward. And I think it's helpful sometimes to ask yourself, what is normal for mortgage rates? Well, in a healthy economy with low inflation and nothing funky going on in financial markets, I think that the mortgage rate ought to incorporate three things. First of all, it ought to incorporate a real risk-free return. If I'm going to lend you money and you're going to get to buy stuff with the money that I give you, you need to pay me back for that, and I ought to get something in return. And that if I knew I'd get paid back with certainty and there was no inflation, I still would need some interest rate to compensate me for letting you use my money for a period of time. I think that that ought to be roughly equal to the real growth rate in the economy. And so I'm going to call that 2 to 3%. Looks like I got a little bit off on my ranges here, so hold on, we'll get there. The premium for expected inflation then. When I lend you money today, you pay me back with dollars in the future that don't buy as much stuff. I need to account for that and build in a premium. That should be roughly equal to the Fed's inflation target. So I call that 1.5 to 2.5%. And finally, I need to be compensated for risk. Sometimes when I lend you money, you don't pay me back, and so I need to build in a premium for that. And historically, that premium for risk has been between 1.5 to 2.5%. So if I add in all those things together, then that suggests that the normal range for a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage ought to be between 5 and 8%. And where we are right now, 6.1% is the most recent figure that was just released this morning. We are right in the sweet spot of that. And the point that I want to make with this is that when it comes to housing affordability, we shouldn't expect anything to change based on mortgage rates. In fact, I would argue we don't want housing affordability to come about because mortgage rates get substantially lower. Now you may say, what? Why don't you want lower mortgage rates? Well, if we had mortgage rates that were below this 5%, 6% range where we are right now, that would mean that something strange was going on in the economy that was causing the Federal Reserve to intervene in the mortgage market. And that would mean that there's fundamental economic problems that are much more severe than the affordability issue that we're dealing with. And the Mortgage Bankers Association, so this is just the recent 30-year fixed mortgage rate and 15-year mortgage rate, and where the Mortgage Bankers Association is forecasting the 30-year fixed mortgage rate between 6 and 6.5% through the end of next year. And I think that's very realistic. We are in a stable period right now, which is, I think, a good, healthy thing. So, what then are the other components that are driving affordability? Well, one of the big issues that we've had here has been the rapid increase in home price appreciation over the last several years. The blue line on this chart shows the year-over-year percentage change in home prices in Kansas. The red line is the United States. Of course, in the wake of COVID, we had just this explosion of existing home prices, which really was the function of a surge in demand because of some policy responses at the federal level to deal with COVID that came in the face of a severe lack of inventory when we entered into that. So if you see a surge in demand with a limited supply, the way markets deal with that, prices go up. And we saw very, very sharp increases in home price appreciation. That appreciation has slowed in the last year or two, but it is still at a very strong, I would argue, not unusual level, but still pretty strong. And indeed, home price appreciation in Kansas over the last couple of years has been stronger than it has been in the U.S. as a whole. What drives this home price appreciation? Well, it's being driven by the fact that the housing market is still tilted with the balance of supply and demand leaning more towards the sellers in the market. This is a measure that we call months supply. It takes the number of active listings and it compares it with the number of homes that are selling on average each month. And so right now, we normally think of a balanced market as having between a 4 and a 6 month supply. That's why that gray shaded region is on this chart. And you can see that in Kansas, we've not been in a balanced market by this measure since all the way back in 2015. And we are extremely tight, and even after the increases over the last few years in the month supply, we're still well below this 4-month supply number. And one of the other thing I'd take away from this picture is sometimes we look at national reporting, and we think, oh, that's what's affecting us. We are still in a much tighter inventory situation in Kansas than the U.S. average housing market. And so even if you hear that there are some markets across the country where they may have home price appreciation that's flatlined or may even be falling, we're not seeing those pressures in Kansas. We are still seeing increases in home price appreciation. And the reason for this is the lack of inventory. This is the number of homes available for sale in Kansas as reported by Realtor MLS systems across the state. And you can see back in 2012, 2013, as we were coming out of the financial crisis and the housing downturn then, we had upwards of 15,000 homes available for sale across the state. We worked our way down to about 10,000 homes available for sale prior to COVID. And if you heard my presentations or the forecast that I did for the Center for Real Estate at that time, I talked about the problem being a lack of inventory and that this was really putting upward pressure on home prices. Then in the face of COVID, we saw this juiced up demand that just ate away inventories. I had realtors who were telling me then, we don't have months supply, we have days supply and maybe even hours supply. Again, inventories have picked up quite a bit over the last 2 or 3 years, but notice that we're still only at about 7,500 homes available for sale across the state of Kansas, which is below that 10,000 figure that we had prior to COVID when inventories were still too low. And why do we see this shortage of inventory? It really relates back to a long-term decline in new home construction. These are monthly single-family building permits across the state of Kansas. The red line is a moving average to get through some of the seasonality. And you can see that going back in the late 90s and early 2000s, we would have between 750 and 1,000 new homes being built every single month in Kansas. But in the wake of the financial crisis, new home construction completely dried up. It dropped down to a low of about 300 new homes a month in the early 20-teens. And even as it's recovered, we're still at levels that are a little better than half as much as we saw prior to the onset of the financial crisis. All of those homes that we failed to build from about 2006 through, let's call it 2015, the real depths of the downturn, those are the move-up homes that middle-class Kansas households, they don't exist when somebody buys their first-time home and they want to move up into the next level of home. Those don't exist, and that's just creating this backlog across all segments of the housing market that creates this really tight inventory. And so what can we do to really try and address this? Ultimately, the problem is a supply problem. We need to be finding ways to encourage new homes to be built. I think that we need to be expansive in how we think about that. But the last slide that I'll leave you with here is something that on one hand is a hopeful picture, but on the other hand, doesn't get at one of the core issues. So over the past 10 years, this is an indexed slide. And so the blue line is existing home prices. And these are all national figures, but they apply to Kansas as well. Over the last 10 years, we've seen existing home prices across the United States essentially double. They went from the 0 to 100%. That's a doubling of home prices over that period of time. In contrast, the red line on this chart is the cost of construction materials for single-family homes, and the green line is the cost of labor. And you can see that those costs have gone up a little over 50% over the last 10 years. We were all very familiar with those sharp increases in construction costs over the period of COVID, but existing home prices have increased even more. And so this should, I hope, give some room to be able to help builders be able to build homes. But there's one big component that's not built into any of these measures, which is the cost of land. And if there's one thing we used to have in abundance in Kansas that made it really easy for us to keep our housing inexpensive, and it's still inexpensive compared to some other areas, it was that we have land, lots of land, and sunny skies above, right? We've got the land going out. But regulatory costs and the cost of infrastructure is the other major component. And these are costs that have gone up substantially and make it very, very difficult. If we go back to the early 2000s, prior to the onset of the financial crisis, a significant number of our new homes that were being built were at what I would call a low-level move-up home price. Not necessarily a first-time home, but a home that was a very achievable next step for a lot of home buyers. Now it's very difficult for home builders across the state to build anything below 300, 350,000, 400,000. And that's a big step up from where might be the sweet spot of a $250,000 home. It's just not possible for builders to do that. And a lot of that comes from the cost of that infrastructure and the land costs. And so as you think about policy solutions and things moving forward, that would be one area where I think there's low-hanging fruit to address. And with that, I will answer any questions you have. I hope I didn't run too long.
So it's all coming back to me now. I can remember your presentation at the joint committee we had last summer, and I walked away from that feeling a lot better about our situation because we're kind of going through what's normal now, and we were just kind of spoiled over the last several years.
We were a little spoiled, and that's hard to say for people who've never experienced what was there before, but yes.
And I think I mentioned at the time that I wish I was in school. I wish you were a professor when I was in school, because I would take your class. You're very easy to follow, and you do a great job.
Thank you.
Representative Sutton has one question. In committee, thanks so much for sticking around, because this is stuff that we might be talking about a little bit later with some of our bills. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, I have a host of questions, and I'd love to talk to you offline because I know we don't have a lot of time here. But just to get probably to the most case side example, one of the things that you mentioned is regulatory costs. That's one of them that we do here. Describe to me what you're talking about and what we can do to alleviate some of that pain.
Well, a lot of the regulatory costs do come down to local communities, right? They're local choices that communities make in terms of what are the permitting requirements that are there. What is one of the most challenging things for developers, and this is true whether it is residential development or commercial development, is uncertainty in the process. The more certainty that I have of, okay, if I go through these steps, here's the timeline that it's going to take, here is what I'm going to end up with, so that I know as I start this process, I have predictability about where that goes. Whenever there are delays that are built into that, home builders typically will have to acquire that land, and they will have holding costs associated with that. And the longer they have to wait in order to actually begin subdividing it, putting in infrastructure, selling it to home builders and so forth, that adds to the costs that they have to build into those lots. So that is one of those pieces. With home builders, it's a question of what are the delays that get built into the cost, to the process of getting inspections done and making sure that we've met that. We all want to have good, safe homes that have been inspected. I don't know what's going on behind the sheetrock in my house and make sure that the electrical work has been done. But is that moving forward in an efficient pace and in a well-timed pace such that we're minimizing the added delays that home builders have with that? Are we adding on extra regulations that are niceties, but not everybody needs to drive a BMW? Maybe a good Chevy is a good car to have. We can say the same thing with housing in terms of, are we adding in some extra costs in terms of regulatory burdens that are adding costs that are not necessary to have a good, safe home? And so those are the types of questions that we want to address.
All right, committee, we're gonna cut it off there. I hope you could stick around for a couple more questions.
I'm happy
privately.
to stay around for a few minutes if anybody has questions beyond this. Thank you.
Thanks again for coming all the way in twice. Committee, we'll see you Monday for a